Welcome back to the second part of the Blender Beginner tutorial. Now we will improve this sad-looking house, which could be a beginner house from Minecraft, as blocky as it is, to make it look a bit better, something like this. If you still have your tree from the previous tutorial in the clipboard, you can now paste it with Ctrl+V. Copying in Blender works the same as in Windows or Linux. I want this tree to stand here in the front garden. You know you can move a tree with G. And if you press Y or X, you move it along that axis. You can also move the tree on two axes at the same time. To do this, hold Shift to exclude the axis you do not want to move along. For this, I press G, then hold Shift and press Z. Now I move it on every axis except the Z axis. This works with all other axes as well. Alternatively, we can get the tree here by using the 3D cursor. I hold Shift and right-click here to move the cursor, then hold Shift+S and select Selection to Cursor. Now let's clean up this very messy property and learn the delete function. In Blender, you can delete things by selecting them, then pressing X and then delete. Of course, selecting and deleting everything one by one is time-consuming. But you can also select multiple things at once. And I don't mean the box select we already learned, but by holding Shift and clicking. Important, if something is already selected and you start selecting more with Shift held down, the first selection remains selected. So if you press Delete, for example, the tree will also be gone. We don't want that. The first click you make is a normal click. Then only that is selected. After that, click everything else while holding Shift. Then X, delete. And you can now repeat this for the rest of the house. And don't forget the objects on the ground. Thank you. Let's finally give this house some slanted roofs. To do this, we need to switch to Edit mode. We can do that up here. But right now, we only have Object mode. How can that be? We need to select an object first. In Object mode, as the name suggests, we select entire objects. And we edit them here in Edit mode after selecting the house. Now you see some lines, and we can move each individual line or even vertices. But strangely, I can't select this edge alone, only the entire faces. That's because we are in Face Select mode. There are three modes, and the icons pretty much say it all. There is Vertex Select mode. We can also enter it by pressing 1. There is Edge Select mode and Face Select mode. To select edges, we should of course be in Edge Select mode, and now it works to select these lines. A very short explanation of what a face, an edge and a vertex are. A vertex is a corner point. An edge consists of at least 2 vertices, and a face consists of at least 3 edges. If only one edge exists, there is no face. Or even if theoretically this edge here is gone and only 2 remain, there is also no face. And an edge needs at least 2 vertices. Of course, we can also delete faces and vertices, just like we did with objects. Let me show you quickly. If I select a face here, I can press X to delete the face, edges, or vertices. Deleting the face creates a hole like this. And if I delete vertices, for example, I delete the corner points that are also selected. Every face selection also selects the edges and vertices, and then the hole looks like this. Because, as just mentioned, this face here is missing this vertex. Because I also delete this one here. And then there is a huge hole in the roof. Keep that in mind. So, to achieve our goal, we need to be in Vertex or Edge Select mode. You already know everything else. You know how to move trees and branches, and you can apply the same here with the roof, completely on your own. Select the corresponding edges and vertices and move them upwards until the roof texture flips. I'll give you a moment. You can pause, and more tips will appear if you don't know what to do. And after that, I'll reveal the solution. So, let me show you the solution. I select these vertices here, or the edges. They remain selected if I switch from vertex to edge select mode. These, not these here, and then I move them upwards until this texture here flips. Now we have a small roof here. You can think about it again. Here, I only want to move this center point upwards. Of course, I need to be in vertex select mode for that, and then I move it upwards until the texture flips. Cool. Now let's push the door and windows a bit into the wall. For this, we need to learn something new, the extrude function. You can guess which key might be used for extrude. First, we need to select faces. We can also select the door via the vertices, but that takes longer. So I go into face select mode with 3 and select the door like this. I focus on the door now with the period key on the numpad. You probably guessed it. If it's called extrude, it must be the E key. That is correct. Now I can press E and push something out or in. It doesn't matter. With the mouse, I determine where it should go. With a right click, I cancel the movement of the extrude. That doesn't mean the extrude isn't there. If I move this now, you can see new faces have been created here. If you want to cancel something, like an extrude, you need to press Ctrl+Z afterward. Now you see these faces are no longer there. Keep that in mind, it's important. Often beginners do this, and then they have overlapping faces, which looks very bad in renderings later. But like everything in Blender, besides a right click, we can also confirm this with a left click. So now you know how to select multiple things with Shift and how to extrude. You can go ahead and work on the windows. And ideally do the window sills after the windows as well. But those should go out, not in. I'll give you a few seconds. So let me solve this. You probably had 1 or 2 problems and got frustrated. If I select all windows at the same time, I have faces pointing in this direction and faces pointing in that direction. The problem, Blender always takes the average direction of the faces to extrude. But this isn't a problem because we can now use this extrude behavior to our advantage. As I said earlier, the faces remain here. This means if extrude itself fails here, we can either move each window individually with G and then X to push it in and use Y for the side, or we can leave everything selected and learn something new, shrink fatten. With Alt+S, we can use shrink fatten. This is my absolute favourite way to scale something because it always depends on the phase or the direction the face is pointing. Now let's go through the whole process again for the windowsills. I select all at once press E and have the same problem as before. They become skewed. I cancel with a right click and press Alt+S, then push it out. At first, you might get annoyed and think, why doesn't Blender delete these faces when I cancel and extrude? But as you can see, it makes perfect sense. I can tell you, not many tutorials cover this. You have a massive speed advantage if you do it this way. Speaking of speed advantages, you should really take notes on this. By the way, speed advantage. Here, the material is wrong. I want all of this to be concrete, like here, grey. Now, we could either select everything individually, or since we already have a selection here, we can select more around our current selection. And I do that by pressing Ctrl and plus on the numpad. That was really quick. A lot of time saved. Then, let's go to the material properties. And here we see all the materials of the currently selected object, which is the house. And here, we can simply go to Concrete and press Assign, which assigns the material to the selected faces. If there is a Select More, there is also a Select Less with Control and minus on the numpad. It will take some getting used to, but if you keep this in mind and think outside the box, you can use all of this to your advantage. If you want to learn more about Shrink Fatten, or selection, you can scan the QR codes. These are quick showcases how to use it in detail with real examples. Now, you should know enough to follow these tutorials. Let's use the same tool again, but with a small twist. I want to push this foundation out a bit as well. First, how do I quickly select this foundation? Of course, not by holding Shift and clicking everything possible. I can hold Alt and click in the direction I want to select, a so-called loop select. But this doesn't work everywhere, for example, not here. It always stops. Blender always stops where there are more or less than 4 vertices. That's why artists generally want quads, faces with 4 vertices. Because as soon as there are only 3 or more than 4, there are exactly these kinds of problems. Blender is a mathematical software. It just looks if a side of a polygon is opposite, and this is mathematical only for quads, a possible case. But that's not a problem for us because we are smart. It's enough if I can select just this part at the bottom like this, because I can press Ctrl++ on the numpad again to select more. And now I press E again. E creates the geometry I need. But of course, it moves it completely useless again. I cancel with a right click and press Alt+S. But now there's a twist. You can see this better when looking from above. Shrink Fatten always tries to round off edges around corners, but as with almost every tool in Blender, we have some information here at the bottom. As long as I'm still in Shrink Fatten, in this tool usage, I can press S and enable even thickness, for example. And now you can see this edge remains a sharp edge. Now I can make it a bit smaller again, so it looks more natural. And to apply the concrete material here, I can press Ctrl and plus on the numpad once more, and then Assign. That was relatively quick, wasn't it? While we can select more with Shift held down, we can also select less with Shift held down. You can now select this terrace, this staircase, and this roof. Then press E to extrude it out. And now I want this face here to remain just a small step. I can hold Shift and click on it, and now this face is deselected. This, of course, also works the other way around, and then we can press E again and extrude it further. Now we have a small step for the entrance door. For the material up here, same as before. Ctrl and plus on the numpad, and then Assign concrete. It would be cool if we had a column here now. What a luck! There is a column in my starter pack. You can find it here in the first scene if you remember. We have two columns here, the huge one and the small one. Of course, we can copy this small one with Ctrl+C into the clipboard. Then we go back to the editing scene and can paste it with Ctrl+V. But be careful, you must switch to object mode first, because we copied the column object, not the geometry itself. The column is now up here. To bring it down, we can simply use the 3D cursor. Hold Shift, right-click here, then Shift+S and select Selection to Cursor. Much faster than having to move it down manually. After that, we can adjust it a bit more. You can also move this column to this side now if you want. You already know how to do this with Shift+D, but here I wouldn't use Shift+D, I'd use Alt+D. What's the difference? Let me make a Shift+D copy and an Alt+D copy. A Shift+D copy is an independent copy. An Alt+D copy is just an instance. As you can see, the original column also changes, and this can be continued 1,000 times. If I want to edit this one column, then I edit all of them at the same time. This sometimes makes sense. If I want a variation, I use Shift+D. To repeat this and not forget what we learned with the tree, we can now distribute these trims around the entire house. You can also do this with Alt+D. You know all the things you need for this. I'll give you a little time and then solve it right away. So, let me show you the solution. I copy it now with Alt+D. Using Shift+D isn't a big deal either. It's best to go into top view and then rotate it. To prevent it from rotating spontaneously, I can also hold Ctrl and then the rotation snaps, just like the movement snaps to the grid. We also see here at the top that the rotation moves in 5-degree increments. This makes editing here much easier. Alternatively, you can press R, and while in rotation mode, enter 90 or -90 on the numpad. You can enter the wildest numbers up there with the numpad. And for the inner edge, you can use this and move it here. Just be a bit creative. And coincidentally, I just noticed this bay window here. It's still missing windows. How do I get windows into this bay window? If I just press E and extrude, it doesn't look that great now. Of course you can do that, but let's learn something new. An inset. An inset, like I for inset. You can press on the keyboard and then this happens. This is, alongside extrude, a very important function. And combined with these things, you can model almost anything. But now, I want these windows to separate. As with shrink fatten earlier, we have options at the bottom. Now we just press I for individual and confirm with a left click. Now we press E for extrude again. Of course, completely useless again. So cancel with a right click and press Alt+S, and we push it in a bit. Now the texture doesn't really fit, so we can simply assign Windows Single to the new faces. You can also use Windows Double. I think this also looks good. But I'll stick with Windows Single. If you want, you can also make a windowsill here using the same methods you know. Here too, pressing S during shrink fatten has an advantage. I would enable even thickness almost every time. The problem is you have to reactivate it every time, so remember that. So we are almost done with the house. I hope you aren't almost done yourself. Let's move on to the garden. Let's start with the terrace. First, let's switch back to object mode. You can also do this with tab. You don't always have to click here. Then, let's click on this terrace. I'll switch back to edit mode. I want this terrace to extend to the stairs so that there's a small path here. And from these stairs to the sidewalk, a path. The problem is, if I just extrude or move this, the path is a bit thick. So we need more geometry here. How do I add more geometry here? You're going to learn a new function. Adding a loop cut, which you can do with Ctrl+R. When you approach an edge, you'll see that Blender changes the direction of this loop cut. You can also add multiple loop cuts at once, with the scroll wheel, for example, as many as you have tiles here. But let's start with one. Then click, and you can move the loop cut. You would confirm it with a left click. With a right click, you cancel, and then it's exactly in the middle of the face or the edge. You should remember this. It can be very advantageous later when modelling if you need extreme symmetry. Otherwise, you can use edge slide to move the edge loop and then slide it here. Now we have a new face that we can select in face select mode, and we can extrude it just like the windows or the window sills. I'll extrude mine up to here. Of course, yours might look different if it completely disappears into the stairs. You can also click down here. You don't necessarily have to see the face to click on it. As you can see, I can also select this face here, even though I clicked here. Now I need another edge loop, so I press Ctrl+R and slide it here. And now I can select this in face select mode and extrude it here. Either all the way to the end or approximately to here. I'll add something else later, so I advise you maybe not to make the path all the way to the end, but of course you can if you want. You see, modelling is just creating faces you can transform. You can also move this terrace to the house wall in object mode. Ideally if you prefer the path. But I also want flower beds everywhere here. So I select this flower bed, focus on it, and now we have two options. Either we go into edit mode. Here the flowers disappear, but that's not a problem. They'll come back as soon as we're in object mode. In edit mode, we can now select faces, for example these, and move them with G and X. We can also move these edges with G and X, and then we can place them around the curve. We can also do this up here. I'll move them down a bit so they align evenly with the wall here. Now, simply moving this doesn't do much. We need to extrude it. And extrude goes in the wrong direction again. Cancel with a right click, and now I'll just manually move it over here. But extrude has created faces down here that we need to delete. Then I can also select this edge and push it in a bit to make this transition smoother here. And here we can now set a loop cut with Ctrl+R Move the individual edges and also push this all the way here. And Extrude does something weird again. Cancel with a right click and then move it on the X-axis with G. So there's a lot of repetition here. I just noticed that when I press Ctrl+R, there's some kind of line here. That's of course the line from down here, because our Extrude created a face down here again. This face itself isn't a problem, but I don't want it, because flowers might spawn on this face down there. Here I can also set this edge here and then move it. You can also do an edge slide by pressing G twice. This is the same as doing this after a loop cut. This is an edge slide, and this here is also an edge slide. Edge slide is good for moving edges along diagonals or to prevent the shape. It also doesn't destroy the UV map, but you will find out later. Now, flower beds everywhere. And what if we want different flowers? Actually, I've set something up for that. If we go into the modifiers here, with the flowers selected, we have the option to select different flowers. But we can only do this per object. And all of this here is just one object. But we can separate things and make them into a new object. For example, I'll now select these faces here with a box select. You don't select anything else in edit mode. You can do a box select, and of course, you only select the things you're currently editing in edit mode. No need to worry. Then, I can simply press P and separate this selection. Now it's its own object. I see the flowers. Why? Because this object here is no longer being edited in edit mode. And I can do this, for example, for this side here as well. Or for this side, whatever. Now, for example, I can select this and have these flowers here. Select this, these flowers, and fill this with these flowers. Not that hard, right? Don't forget to save your project. So, these flower beds are now finished for the time being. But here's a question. What are we actually seeing here? These are modifiers. We'll get to know a few basic modifiers in this tutorial. And we can start right away with this fence. Let's focus on it. If I want this fence to go all the way around, I could copy it and do all the work manually. But I can also use modifiers, for example, the array modifier, which we can find under Generate Array. As you can see, it simply extends this fence by the number we set here. 3 seems to fit well for now. We can duplicate this with Alt+D. In object mode, we always rotate around these dots, the origins. Then, let's move it over here. This doesn't look great right now, but that's not a problem. In object mode, we can simply scale it down a bit on the X-axis. Why not in edit mode? Because we duplicated the fence with Alt+D, of course, if we scale it down, it will also scale the original, just like with the columns earlier. But in object mode, this is allowed because the data is independent, and we can finish it here. No one will notice later that it's slightly smaller. And here, if you want, we can also make the fence a bit longer. And maybe the flower bed a bit longer too. Now let's do the same with this fence in the back. I'll add an array modifier here as well. But it's going in the wrong direction. We have an offset of x1, which means it's going in the positive y direction, but we want it in the negative y direction. We can simply put a minus sign in front of the 1. Then I'll go into Top View, duplicate this fence, move it here, reduce the count and attach it here. But now I can't get close enough, even though I focused on it. I can barely move here. A trick. This is actually a bit like being in edit mode. When I focus on this in object mode, I get the whole object in view. But in edit mode, I only have these few segments and can get much closer. And of course, I can use this to get this part closer to the fence and work more precisely. Now let's learn another modifier. If I copy this fence over here, I have the problem that these crossbars are on the wrong side. They're usually on the inside everywhere else. Not a big deal. If we rotate it, we have another problem. Now I'm missing an end post. We can simply mirror this fence over. To do that, I go to Add Modifier, Generate, Mirror. At first, it mirrors around itself. But we can also select this ground as the mirror object. Now, we don't see anything. That's because it's mirroring on the x-axis, but we want it on the y-axis. We can disable the x-axis. And now it's mirrored. The great thing is, if we move this, the mirrored version moves with it. Since we're on the topic of array, we can continue with the hedge. For this hedge, I want to make a small carport, so I'll also add an array modifier. But now there's a gap. How did that happen? Let me go into edit mode for this hedge. I see that if I move a vertex here, the hedge moves because the offset on the x-axis is relative to the size of the hedge. So the hedge essentially gets larger because the bounds of this hedge are larger. We can fix this by slightly reducing this offset, for example, to 0.88. But the problem is that if we move something in the hedge now, the same thing happens again. But we can also set a constant offset. This is a bit too close, so let's set it to 3.88 meters. And if I now move something in edit mode, the hedges don't move at all. These are the two options with an array modifier. Relative is always dependent on the object. Offset is always constant. Now we can build this carport. A car is supposed to drive in here. Instead of setting the count to 1, we can simply delete the modifier. Now, to get this shrubbery out of the masonry, we can either push the hedge further in or simply scale this part down. It won't be very noticeable if you don't overdo it. So, the garden is actually already relatively finished, but there's still a lot more to do. In principle, we are already finished with this house, but for those who want to do a little more, here are some specials, such as inserting another window here completely independently or turning this tablecloth into a real tablecloth. For that, we need a cloth simulation. If you don't want to make this tablecloth, you can simply delete it, but if you do want to make it, go to the Physics tab, to the Physics properties, and simply select Cloth here. Now, my tablecloth has suddenly disappeared. That's because I am far advanced in my timeline, maybe you are too. Simply press Jump to Start Point here to jump to the first frame, then it should be back. Cloth simulations. or simulations in general, depend on our time here at the bottom in the timeline. If we are further advanced, the simulation is also further advanced. Now that we have activated cloth and are at the beginning, we can press play in the timeline. And we see that the cloth simply falls through the floor and through the table. Why? Because the table itself still needs collision. Select the table, and in the physics properties we also have collision here. Let's activate that. We can ignore particles here. We're focusing on soft body and cloth. This check mark here must be removed for single-sided, because this table here is not single-sided. Single-sided is something like this cloth, as it only has one side, while this table has multiple sides and is closed. So you can remember, the cloth itself does not need collision. It automatically checks for it. If we press play again now, we see it collides with this table, but the cloth looks very stiff. And of course, this tablecloth falls through the floor, because the floor also has no collision. But it doesn't need it. Let me go back. I'll take a close look at this tablecloth now, and I see that all these quads here are relatively large. The smaller they are, the better the resolution of this animation. And we can do that by selecting everything. You can also do this with A or double A to deselect everything. Then you can right-click and select Subdivide. Right-click also generally opens a menu that always depends on the mode we are in. So here in Edge Select mode, I have different options than in Vertex Select mode or Face Select mode. So I'll quickly undo that. Right-click, Subdivide, and then set number of cuts to 2. I wouldn't go too high, as the simulation will become slower. Now we can press play again. And look, it already behaves much more like a tablecloth. We don't have to let it run until the end. We can also pause it in the middle if nothing more is happening here or if we are satisfied. So that the tablecloth stays like this. We see a blue line at the bottom in the timeline. This is everything that has already been calculated in the simulation. If I click here outside the blue line, errors will probably occur because nothing has been calculated here yet. So I stay within this blue area. And to keep the tablecloth like this, we can go into the modifiers, because a cloth simulation is also just a modifier, and we can apply it here with the down arrow. Now we can also edit it in edit mode. Then you can still move your chairs here and make everything look much cozier. I want to add a window here in the gable now. Click on the house and switch to edit mode. Here, I have no geometry at all to put a window in. That means we need to create new geometry, just like we did with the terrace. We go into Edge Select mode, and we just used Subdivide. Subdivide doesn't always have to be applied to an entire face. We can also select these edges here, right-click, and then Subdivide. Now we have a line here, we can repeat this below. And also add a subdivision here between these lines. If we go into orthographic view on X, we see that this line is not straight. It would be nice if the window were naturally straight. We can get a line straight by scaling it to 0. No, not by simply scaling it smaller, but by locking the y-axis, of course. We lock the y-axis, and then you can see that the further I move the mouse, the higher I increase the scaling multiplier. Here at the top, we see it's now at 20. So the edge is now 20 times as slanted as before. Instead of moving the mouse so far that we reach 0, which we would almost never achieve, we can simply enter 0 on the numpad, just like with the fences and trims earlier. Now, it's definitely scaled to 0. They are now perpendicular to each other. This works very well with edges. With faces, it would naturally be a bit more problematic because these edges would then lie exactly on top of each other. With standard settings, scaling always scales the entire selection to the center. You can also do this with whole objects. It looks like this. Not recommended. It can even lead to crashes if you animate such zero-scaled objects. But with individual edges, it's no problem at all. And now we're learning something new. Instead of adding more subdivides here, which we would naturally all have to multiply by 0 on the y-axis, we can simply select this edge here and then bevel it. You bevel with Ctrl+B, and then, like with the terrace earlier or with the loop cut, you can add multiple segments with the scroll wheel. I'll add one here now because I want to bevel this in the middle again. Now I scroll down so that I only get one segment. Now I want 2 windows here. In Face Select mode, I can select each of these windows and extrude them as you're used to. And now I'll add a material. And the material doesn't look very good now. That's because these faces I just created didn't exist before, while these faces here did exist. If I do an inset here, the texture doesn't change. But here, I didn't inset anything. I freshly created it, but that's not a problem at all. We simply go to the front, to the X orthographic view, and press U, then select Project from View with Bounds. What does this do? This is called unwrapping, hence the U key, also known as UV mapping. And there are some things here that we will cover in the last part of this tutorial. Many beginners hate this topic, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually quite straightforward. But luckily it's relatively simple here because we're simply unwrapping based on our current perspective, as the name suggests. That's why it's important that we look straight at it. Because if I do it at an angle like this, the window looks like this. It's important that we look straight at it and then select Project from View with Bounds. All right, that's it for this part. In the next part, we'll cover sculpting and vertex paint and do a few small repetitions. Thanks for watching and have fun learning.